The city is on fire. Not one building, not one street. The whole city, the warehouses by the harbor, the merchant houses in the upper quarter, the palace on the hill, all of it burning simultaneously, the way things burn when the burning is deliberate. The sky above Ugarit is the color of a wound. It is approximately 1190 BCE, roughly 3,200 years ago, and the greatest trading city on the Mediterranean coast is dying, and a king named Ammurapi is still at his desk. He is writing a letter. His army is gone, deployed somewhere else, on someone else's orders, weeks away. His ships are gone. The grain stores are empty. The people in the streets below his window are running, though there is nowhere left to run to. And Ammurapi, king of Ugarit, ruler of the wealthiest city on the Syrian coast, a man who has spent his reign corresponding with pharaohs and Hittite emperors as an equal, is pressing a reed into wet clay and asking for help. "My enemy ships came," he writes. "My cities were burned. They did evil things in my country." He asks for ships, for soldiers, for anything. Nobody came. We know this because the letter was found exactly where he left it, still on the desk, still in the city, baked hard by the fire that took everything else. The archaeologists who found it in the 20th century had to read it carefully. It was sent to no one. It helped nothing. It survived only because the fire that made it irrelevant also made it permanent. 32 bronze arrowheads were scattered through the residential streets, 12 more in the open roads leading to the harbor. The walls had collapsed inward, the roofs had fallen, and running through the entire site, just above the floor level of every building, a thin black layer, compressed ash, charred wood, scorched brick, the end of a city. Except it wasn't just a city. At the same moment, within the same 50 years, across the entire eastern Mediterranean, the same black layer appears in the ruins of the Hittite capital, in Mycenae, in Troy, in Cyprus, in city after city after city, from Greece in the west to Canaan in the south. The same ash, the same collapsed walls, the same silence after. Every major civilization on Earth gone. Within 50 years. This is called the Bronze Age collapse, the most sudden, the most complete, yet the most mysterious civilizational catastrophe in recorded human history. A world that had taken 1,000 years to build, gone in 50. And nobody, not then, not now, not with every tool modern archaeology has, fully understands why. That is where we are tonight. In the fire, at the desk, with a letter that was never sent and a world that was never rebuilt. But before we go further, we need to go back to what this world actually was before it burned. Because the Bronze Age at its peak was something so extraordinary, so connected, so alive, that the only way to feel the full weight of what was lost is to first understand what was there. On this channel, we don't just tell you history. We tell you how people lived through it, the fear and the fire and the 400 years of silence after. We tell you what they held onto when everything else was gone, what they built from the ruins, stone by stone, generation by generation, until the world was whole again. We tell you the human story underneath the history, because that story, the one about ordinary people surviving extraordinary things, that story belongs to you as much as it belongs to them. That is where we're going tonight. But first, the world before the fire. It is 1250 BCE, roughly 3,250 years before tonight. And the world is extraordinary. Not primitive, not struggling toward civilization. Extraordinary. The Bronze Age, where at its peak in the 13th century BCE, was the first truly globalized era in human history. a network of kingdoms and trading cities stretching from Greece in the west to Mesopotamia in the east, from Anatolia in the north to Egypt in the south, all of them trading with each other, writing to each other, occasionally fighting each other, and collectively sustaining a level of wealth and sophistication that the world would not see again for 2,000 years. Bronze gives the age its name. And bronze, the alloy of copper and tin that makes the tools and weapons that build and defend everything, requires two metals that almost never occur in the same place. Tin from Central Asia, carried overland for thousands of kilometers by donkey caravan. Copper from Cyprus, from Anatolia, from Sardinia. For bronze to exist at all, the trade networks have to function. For the Bronze Age to work, the whole world has to work together. That is what makes what's coming so hard to understand. But we're not there yet. Right now, it is 1250 BCE, and you are standing on the harbor front of a city called Ugarit. Ugarit, on the Mediterranean coast of what is now Syria, roughly 3,200 years before you were born, was the greatest trading port in the Bronze Age world. Not the largest city, not the most powerful militarily, but the place where every trade network on Earth converged simultaneously. Sitting at the junction of the overland routes from Mesopotamia and the maritime routes of the Mediterranean, it was the city where things arrived from everywhere and went everywhere else. The Rotterdam of the ancient world, the place that kept the whole system moving. The harbor in front of you is in full motion, ships being loaded and unloaded simultaneously along the entire length of the dock, their crews calling to each other in at least 4 languages: Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the Bronze Age that everyone used the way the modern world uses English; Hittite from traders down from Anatolia; Egyptian from a vessel just arrived from the Nile Delta; and beneath all of it, the local Ugaritic tongue, quick and clipped, the language of the people who actually run this place. What they are unloading would stop you if you knew what you were looking at. Copper ingots from Cyprus, each one cast in the shape of an ox hide, weighing 29 kilograms, and stacked on the dock like a metallic forest. Tin from mines in what is now Uzbekistan, carried 2,000 kilometers overland before it even reached water. Ivory from Egypt, Mycenaean pottery from mainland Greece, cedar wood from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, gold dust in sealed clay jars, horses from Anatolia. All of it converging on this one harbor. The entire Bronze Age world in a single morning's unloading. In the merchant quarter, a man named Ertanu is at his desk. He is a member of what we might call an international trading firm, conducting business on behalf of the state and private clients simultaneously, with trading ties stretching to Cyprus, to the Euphrates markets, to cities he has never personally visited, but whose merchants he knows by their seal impressions. His archive contains letters, accounting ledgers, records of copper exports and grain imports, correspondence in multiple languages. At any given moment, he has shipments on 3 different ships, a caravan somewhere on the overland route from the Euphrates, and outstanding correspondence with a dozen counterparts in the cities across the Bronze Age world. He is not exceptional. He is, in Ugarit in 1250 BCE, entirely ordinary. This is what the Bronze Age looks like at its peak. Not warriors and pharaohs, merchants at desks, scribes writing letters, ships in harbors. A world so thoroughly connected that a drought in Anatolia affects grain prices in Egypt, that a new copper source in Cyprus changes a merchant's calculations in Ugarit, that a political dispute between 2 kings ripples through trade networks that neither of them fully controls. 3 civilizations anchor this world, and you need to feel what each of them was before we watch what happens to them. To the north, in the mountains of central Anatolia, in what is now Turkey, sits Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire. The Hittites were one of the great superpowers of the Bronze Age, the only civilization on Earth that Egypt treated as a military equal. Their empire stretched across Anatolia and into northern Syria, from the Aegean coast in the west to the Euphrates in the east, and at its heart sat Hattusa, a city enclosed by 8 kilometers of massive stone walls, one of the most heavily fortified places in the ancient world. Yeah, the Lion Gate stands at the city's entrance. 2 enormous stone lions carved flanking the doorway, staring outward with the calm confidence of a civilization that has never seriously considered the possibility of losing. Inside those walls, palaces, temples, royal archives containing thousands of clay tablets recording Hittite law, diplomacy, and literature. One of those tablets, a copy is now displayed at the United Nations building in New York, is the Treaty of Kadesh, signed between the Hittite king and Ramesses II of Egypt in 1259 BCE, the world's first known peace treaty. Written in cuneiform in both Hittite and Akkadian, it settled the border between the 2 greatest empires on earth and guaranteed that neither would attack the other again. In 1250 BCE, that treaty is 9 years old. The border is stable. The empire is at peace. In Hattusa, the king's scribes are recording land grants and legal settlements, and priests are conducting ceremonies in temples dedicated to 1,000 gods, and the city feels, as powerful cities always feel to the people who live in them, permanent, inevitable, the kind of thing that simply does not end. To the southwest, across the Aegean, on the Greek mainland, is Mycenae. Mycenae, the palace civilization that Homer would later transform into legend, that Schliemann would spend his life searching for, that turns out to have been real all along, dominated mainland Greece in the Bronze Age from roughly 1600 to 1200 BCE. This is the world of the great citadels, massive stone fortresses perched on defensible hills, controlling the surrounding territory, administering economies of extraordinary complexity from palace archive rooms lined with clay tablets. Those tablets are written in a script called Linear B, the earliest known form of the Greek language. A writing system so different from the classical Greek alphabet that scholars couldn't read it until 1952, when a British architect named Michael Ventris deciphered it and discovered to everyone's astonishment that it was Greek. Ancient, abbreviated, bureaucratic Greek, but Greek. The same language that would produce Homer, Plato, and the New Testament was already being pressed into clay in Bronze Age palace archives. What were they writing about? Mostly what the Sumerians wrote about: grain counts, livestock tallies, tax records. One surviving tablet from the palace at Pylos records the distribution of bovine, pig, and deer hides to shoe and saddle makers. Another records a request for 600 rowers, suggesting someone in the palace feared an attack from the sea. The tablets are so relentlessly bureaucratic that scholars sometimes joke that if Linear B had never been deciphered, we'd have assumed the Mycenaeans were a civilization of accountants. They weren't. They built the Lion Gate at Mycenae, walls so massive that later Greeks, unable to conceive of human beings moving such stones, assumed they had been built by the Cyclops. They traded across the entire Mediterranean. Their pottery has been found in Egypt, in Syria, in Italy, in the British Isles. They were, in 1250 BCE, one of the most powerful and most connected civilizations in the Bronze Age world. And to the south, on the banks of the Nile, 3,000 kilometers from Ugarit, Egypt. Egypt needs no introduction, but Egypt in 1250 BCE deserves one. This is the reign of Ramesses II. Ramesses the Great, the pharaoh who fought the Hittites to a standstill at Kadesh, signed the world's first peace treaty, and then had both facts carved onto every temple wall he could find for the rest of his 66-year reign. He built more, claimed more, and lived longer than almost any pharaoh before or after him. Under his rule, Egypt is at the height of its new kingdom power, its empire stretching from Sudan in the south to Syria in the north, its treasury full, its armies undefeated, its gods reliably appeased. In 1250 BCE, Egypt has been a continuous civilization for 2,000 years. 2,000 years. The pyramids of Giza are already as ancient to Ramesses as Ramesses is ancient to us. Egypt has outlasted every other civilization it has encountered. It has absorbed invasions, survived famines, and navigated the deaths of dynasties. When you have been the most powerful country on earth for 2,000 years, you develop a certain confidence about the future. This is the Bronze Age at its peak. Ugarit and its merchants, Hattusa and its lions, Mycenae and its bureaucrats, Egypt and its eternal certainty. All of them connected, all of them wealthy, all of them in 1250 BCE. Entirely convinced that the world as it exists is the world as it will continue to exist. In Urtenu's archive in Ugarit, there are letters from the years around 1200 BCE that read differently from the ones before them. Requests for grain, urgent ones, from cities that have always had grain. Reports of poor harvests from the Hittite court. A letter from a king in Anatolia asking Ugarit for food because his people are starving. The pollen records in the sediment beneath the Sea of Galilee, each analyzed 3,000 years later by archaeologists with instruments that didn't exist until the 20th century, show a sharp decline in water-dependent vegetation beginning around 1250 BCE. The drought has already started. Nobody in Ugarit knows this yet. Nobody in Hattusa. Nobody standing on the walls of Mycenae or in the temples of Egypt. The morning is bright and warm. The ships are in the harbor. Urtenu goes back to his accounts. He has no idea that within 50 years, every single thing you just stood inside, the harbor, the palace, the lions at the gate, the eternal certainty of Egypt, will be gone. That is the thing about the end of a world. It doesn't feel like the end of a world. It feels like a slightly smaller harvest, like a letter asking for grain from a city that has always had grain, like an ordinary morning. In the next part of tonight's story, we're going to watch it end. Not one civilization, not one city. Every major civilization of the Bronze Age, Ugarit, Hattusa, Mycenae, Egypt, simultaneously within 50 years, in ways that even now, 4,000 years later, no historian fully agrees on. We're going to stand in the ash and read what the people who lived through it wrote down in their final hours. And we're going to ask the question that has no clean answer. What on earth could have done this to all of them at once? The Bronze Age didn't end on a single day. That's the first thing you need to understand about what happened next. There was no invasion that swept across the entire Eastern Mediterranean in one season, no single catastrophe that dropped like a hammer on every civilization simultaneously. It was slower than that. And in some ways, slower is worse, because slow means you can see it coming. Slow means you write letters about it, send messengers, make plans, adjust your budget. You tell yourself it's going to be fine, and then watch it happen anyway. It started as most catastrophes start, with the weather. The drought that the pollen records had been quietly signaling since 1250 BCE, the one nobody in Ugarit or Hattusa or Mycenae had yet connected into a pattern, began to bite hard around 1200 BCE. Not a bad year, not a difficult season, a decade of failing harvests, followed by another decade, followed by another, and across the entire Eastern Mediterranean simultaneously. The climate records, read 3,000 years later from sediment cores and tree rings and ancient pollen trapped in lake beds, are unambiguous. A mega-drought settled over the region and stayed. What that meant, practically, was this: the grain ran out. And in a Bronze Age palace economy, where the palace was simultaneously the granary, the bank, the tax authority, the employer, or and the distributor of everything that kept a city functioning, when the grain ran out, everything ran out. The palace in Hattusa allocated grain to its vassal kingdoms, who used it to pay their workers, who used it to feed their families, who used it to plant next year's crop. Break that chain at any point and the whole system stutters. Break it at the top, at the palace, at the source, and the whole system collapses. See, letters began to arrive in the archives of the great powers asking for grain, not requests, desperate pleas. The Hittite king wrote to the Pharaoh of Egypt, "It is a matter of life and death. Send grain." The Pharaoh sent grain, 20,000 measures of it, loaded onto ships and dispatched across the Mediterranean. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough, because the drought wasn't affecting one kingdom. It was affecting all of them simultaneously. The same sun and the same failed rains, the same shrinking harvests from Greece to Canaan to Anatolia. And then, into this world already straining under the weight of hunger and dwindling resources, came the people who would later be called the Sea Peoples. Nobody knows who the Sea Peoples actually were. That is one of the great, genuinely unsolved mysteries of the Bronze Age. The name itself is a modern invention. The ancient sources call them by various names, refer to confederations of groups with different origins, describe them arriving sometimes by sea and sometimes by land, sometimes as raiders, and sometimes, unmistakably, as families. As people moving with their children and their possessions on ox carts, looking not for plunder, but for somewhere to live. Egyptian reliefs from the reign of Ramesses III, carved into the walls of the temple at Medinet Habu around 1180 BCE, show the Sea Peoples in battle against the Egyptian forces at the Nile Delta. The carvings are extraordinary in their detail. The enemy warriors, their distinctive feathered helmets, their boats, their weapons. And behind the warriors, in the same carvings, the ox carts, women, children, cattle. These were not an army on a raid. They were a migration. An entire population on the move, pressing toward Egypt because everywhere else had already failed. Where did they come from? Scholars have proposed the Aegean, Anatolia, Cyprus, the Italian peninsula, the Balkans. Every theory has evidence in its favor and problems that haven't been resolved. The most honest answer, 4,000 years later, is that they came from the collapsing edges of the Bronze Age world itself. And as the drought failed harvests, and the harvests failed cities, and the cities failed their people, those people moved. They moved toward the coast, toward the ships, toward wherever the food was. And in moving, desperate, hungry, dispossessed, they became the thing that pushed the surviving cities over the edge. Not invaders in the way we usually imagine invaders. Refugees, driven into violence by the same forces that were dismantling everything around them. This is the hardest thing to sit with about the Bronze Age collapse. There was no villain. There was no army of conquerors who looked at a thriving world and decided to destroy it. There were just people in a drought and hunger and the cascading failures of a system so interconnected that when enough pieces broke, the rest couldn't hold. Let's go back to the cities, because this is where it stops being abstract. Hattusa, the Hittite capital, yes, with its lion-flanked gates and its 1,000 gods and its world's first peace treaty carved in silver, did not go down fighting. The last known Hittite king was named Suppiluliuma II. We know almost nothing about him. Only a handful of tablets survive from his reign, describing military campaigns in western Anatolia and naval victories off the coast of Cyprus. And then the records simply stop. Not in the middle of a battle, not in the middle of a crisis. They just stop. The way a conversation stops when the person you're talking to walks out of the room. What the archaeologists found at Hattusa was not a massacre. No bodies in the streets, no treasure abandoned in a hurry, no signs of a desperate last defense at the Lion Gate. The city appears to have been evacuated, systematically over time, the population leaving with what they could carry. The buildings emptied before they were finally burned. The granaries were empty when the excavators found them. So the archives had been stripped. Someone made decisions. Someone organized the departure. And then the fires were set, by the inhabitants themselves, possibly as a final act. And the city that had stood for 500 years became ash and empty rooms. Hattusa was not conquered. It was abandoned. Think about what that means. The capital of one of the most powerful empires on earth, a city whose walls had never been breached by an enemy, was not taken by force. It was simply left. The people who had lived there for generations picked up their lives and walked away, because the system that had made Hattusa worth living in had stopped functioning, and there was nothing left to stay for. That is a different kind of ending from the one we imagine when we think of empires falling. No last stand, no heroic defeat, just the slow realization that the thing you built your life around no longer works. And then the long walk away from it. That is not extraordinary. That is one of the most human things in this entire story. The palace at Pylos in southwestern Greece, the palace of the legendary king Nestor, the oldest and wisest of the Greek heroes at Troy, went down differently. Pylos did not evacuate. Pylos burned, and in the archive rooms of the palace, in the final hours before the fire took everything, the scribes were still working. We know this with a specificity that is almost unbearable, because the fire that destroyed Pylos around 1180 BCE, roughly 3,200 years ago, accidentally did something the scribes never intended. Their clay tablets, normally dried in the sun and discarded at the end of the administrative year, were instead baked hard in the palace fire, made permanent by the thing that ended everything else. And what were they writing in those final hours? Rowers. The tablets record rowers being dispatched to coastal watch stations, 30 at a time, positioned along the Pylian coastline. Soldiers being distributed across the kingdom to specific locations, rations being carefully measured out and allocated, bronze being collected from sanctuaries and temples across the region, not to store it, but to make it into weapons. The scribes at Pylos, in the last days before the palace burned, now were recording a kingdom preparing for an attack it knew was coming. None of those orders were ever carried out. The rowers never reached their stations. The soldiers never took their positions. The bronze was never made into weapons. The scribes never wrote another line. The palace was abandoned and never rebuilt. What survives is the paperwork. The administrative record of a government trying to function normally, allocating resources, dispatching personnel, measuring rations, while the world it administered ceased to exist. 45 scribes, identified by their individual handwriting in the archive. 45 people who went to work that morning the way they had gone to work every morning of their professional lives, and then didn't come back. There is a particular tablet from Pylos that scholars have studied more than almost any other. It is called PYTA 641, the tripod tablet, and it was written by a senior scribe known to scholarship only as Hand 2, possibly named Fugabris, less than a year before the palace burned. It catalogs ritual vessels, tripods, cups, drinking bowls, items to be used in a ceremonial feast to mark the appointment of a new provincial governor. A celebration. An ordinary piece of administrative life in a functioning palace. The tablet was baked in the same fire that ended the palace. The feast it was prepared for may never have taken place. Hand, too, never wrote another tablet. That is what the end of the Bronze Age looked like from the inside. Not heroic, not dramatic, a scribe doing his job, a tablet recording a feast, a fire that preserved the record and ended the civilization that produced it simultaneously. Now, Ugarit. We began tonight in Ugarit, with the fire and the letter and the arrowheads scattered in the streets. We need to go back there now and finish the story that the cold opening started. Ugarit, the greatest trading port of the Bronze Age, the city where every trade network on Earth converged, where Urtnu had his accounts in his archive and his shipments on 3 different ships, received its end in a series of desperate letters that read like a city watching a storm arrive from the horizon and being unable to move. The first sign was the ships, enemy ships spotted offshore, the kind that had been raiding coastal cities further north. King Ammurapi wrote to the Hittite viceroy at Carchemish, Ugarit's political superior, the regional representative of the Hittite Empire. He described what he had seen. He asked for help. The viceroy wrote back. He did not have troops to send. He himself was under pressure, but he told Ammurapi to be strong, to be a man. Be a man. That was the advice from the most powerful political authority in the region to a king watching enemy ships gather off his coast. Ammurapi wrote to the king of Alyshia, Cyprus, with more urgency. The letter that was found baked in the destruction layer, the one we opened tonight with, the one pressed into clay in the hours before the fires reached the upper city. He described ships. 20 ships at first, then more, cities on the coast already burning, his army gone, his fleet gone. The grain stores empty. The help never came. The fires reached Ugarit around 1190 BCE, roughly 3,215 years ago. The city burned in what archaeologists describe as a single catastrophic destruction event. The residential quarters, the merchant houses, the palace, the temple complex, the harbor installations, all of it simultaneously in a fire hot enough to melt bronze fittings and collapse stone walls. The arrowheads scattered in the streets came from the attack. The tablets baked in the archive rooms came from the fire. The silence after came from the fact that nobody survived to rebuild. Ugarit was never reoccupied. The greatest trading city of the Bronze Age, a city that had existed for 1,000 years, simply ceased to exist. The harbor silted up. The buildings crumbled. The site was abandoned so completely that by the classical period, nobody remembered it had been there. Now, it was found by a French archaeologist in 1929 when a Syrian farmer's plow accidentally broke into an ancient tomb. 3,000 years of forgetting, ended by a plow. In Egypt, Ramesses III held the line. The Sea Peoples came at Egypt in the 8th year of his reign, 1177 BCE, roughly 3,200 years ago, by sea and by land simultaneously. The sea battle was fought at the mouth of the Nile Delta, and the Egyptian reliefs at Medinet Habu record it in extraordinary detail. The enemy ships crowded together, their rigging collapsing as Egyptian archers fired from the shore, warriors falling into the water, the battle turning in Egypt's favor through what the reliefs describe as the divine intervention of the gods and what military historians describe as superior positioning and preparation. Ramesses I. He drove the Sea Peoples back from the Nile Delta and settled some of them in Canaan as vassals. Defeated migrants repurposed as border guards, which is either pragmatic or darkly ironic depending on how you look at it. But Egypt's victory was narrower than the reliefs admit. The empire in Canaan and the Levant was gone. The trade networks that had sustained 3 centuries of New Kingdom wealth had collapsed along with everything else. The treasury that had funded Ramesses' building projects was emptying. The papyri from the rain record things that had never been recorded before in the long history of Egyptian civilization. Tomb robbers in the Valley of the Kings, workers striking because their grain rations hadn't been delivered. The workers who built and maintained the royal tombs at Deir el-Medina went on strike in the 29th year of Ramesses III's reign. They downed their tools, marched to the mortuary temples, and sat down. Their demand was simple. They hadn't been paid in over a month, and they were hungry. It was the first recorded labor strike in human history. 3,000 years before the concept of organized labor existed, a group of Egyptian workers looked at their situation, looked at the power that employed them, and collectively decided that the work would stop until the grain arrived. The grain arrived. The work resumed. Ramesses III was assassinated a few years later, stabbed, and the forensic evidence suggests, by multiple attackers in what his own court documents call the Harem Conspiracy. Egypt survived the Bronze Age collapse, technically. But the Egypt that survived was not the Egypt that had sent grain to the Hittites and fought the Sea Peoples to a standstill at the Nile Delta. It was a smaller, poorer, more frightened version of itself. The new kingdom stumbled on for another century and then quietly expired. The age of Egyptian imperial power, 2,000 years of it, was over. In Greece, the lights went out. The Mycenaean palace system, Pylos, Tiryns, Mycenae, Thebes, collapsed within a generation. The palaces burned or were abandoned, the population scattered or declined, and then something happened that has no parallel in the ancient world, something that is perhaps the single most striking fact about the Bronze Age collapse in Greece. Writing disappeared. A linear B, the script that the Mycenaean scribes had used for 3 centuries to record their grain counts and their rower dispatches and their ritual feast preparations, simply stopped being used, not evolved into something simpler, not replaced by another script. Stopped. Completely. For 400 years, there is no written record from Greece. None. A civilization that had been literate for 3 centuries went silent. The Greek Dark Ages lasted from approximately 1100 to 700 BCE, and 400 years of reduced population, smaller settlements, lost trade connections, and complete absence of writing. When Greece emerged from that darkness, when the alphabet that the Phoenicians had preserved was adopted and Greek writing began again, the people using it had no memory of linear B. They had no idea that their ancestors had once written. The Bronze Age had been so completely erased from living memory that when Homer composed the Iliad and the Odyssey, the great stories of the Bronze Age heroes, Achilles and Odysseus and Agamemnon, he was drawing on oral traditions that had been passed by word of mouth for 400 years, through the entire darkness, by poet-singers who memorized thousands of lines and passed them to the next generation. The stories survived. The writing didn't. And when the writing came back, it came back from elsewhere, carried westward by the Phoenicians, who had survived the collapse in their coastal cities and kept the alphabet alive through the dark age that swallowed everything around them. But that is a story for later. By 1100 BCE, roughly 3,125 years ago, the Bronze Age was over. Not declining, over. The Hittite Empire, gone. Ugarit, gone. The Mycenaean palace system, gone. And the trade networks that had connected the known world for 3 centuries, gone. The literacy of Greece, gone. The surplus economies that had built the temples and the lion gates and the peace treaties and the merchant archives, gone. What remained was fragments. Egypt diminished. Some Phoenician cities on the Lebanese coast, still trading, still keeping records, still connecting what was left of the world. Scattered communities in Greece and Anatolia, living in smaller houses. making simpler pottery, trading locally. People, in other words, continuing, not thriving, not rebuilding, just continuing. Because what else do you do? That is not a small thing. In the face of a catastrophe that dismantled the entire known world within 50 years, in the face of drought and displacement and the collapse of every system that had structured daily life for centuries, people kept going. They farmed smaller fields. They built smaller houses. They told their children stories about the great age that had ended, the heroes who had lived in it, the palaces that had once stood on the hills above their villages. They passed those stories forward. That is what resilience looks like when a world actually ends. Not triumph, not recovery, just the refusal to be the last one. Just one more day, one more harvest, one more story told to one more child before the fire went out. They kept going. Enough of them kept going that 400 years later, the lights came back on. But first, the question that has haunted this story from the beginning, the question that historians have argued about for a century, that no conference has fully resolved, that sits at the heart of the greatest mystery in ancient history. What actually caused it? Why did every major civilization of the Bronze Age collapse at once? The drought alone doesn't explain it. The sea peoples alone don't explain it. No single cause has ever satisfied the evidence completely. And the answer, or rather, the absence of a clean answer, is where we're going next. Because the truth about what ended the Bronze Age is more unsettling than any single cause could be. And it has something to say about the world you're living in right now. Here is the question that has haunted historians for over a century. You have just watched every major civilization of the Bronze Age collapse within 50 years. Ugarit, burned and abandoned. Hattusa, evacuated and silenced. Mycenae, its palaces in ash, its writing gone. Egypt, technically surviving but diminished beyond recognition, its empire gone, its treasury emptied, its workers on strike because the grain rations stopped coming. The entire eastern Mediterranean, from Greece to the Levant, from Anatolia to Canaan, collapsed simultaneously within 50 years. What caused it? The honest answer: 4,000 years later. Yet with every tool modern archaeology possesses, with the translated tablets and the pollen cores and the radiocarbon dates and the satellite imaging of buried ruins, is that we don't fully know. Not because historians haven't tried, because the evidence keeps pointing in multiple directions at once, and every theory that explains one part of the collapse fails to explain another. The Bronze Age collapse is not a mystery for lack of evidence. It is a mystery because the evidence is genuinely complicated. And the most intellectually honest position after a century of scholarship is to say, it was probably several things, at once, amplifying each other, in ways that made each individual disaster survivable, but their combination unsurvivable. That is not a satisfying answer. But it is the true one. And the truth of it, the specific way in which this catastrophe assembled itself from multiple causes, is more unsettling than any single villain could be. Let's go through the theories. Not as a list, as a story. Because each one is a story about how a complex world comes apart. The first theory is the one with the most evidence behind it. The drought. We have already met it. The pollen records from the Sea of Galilee, the sediment cores from Cyprus, yes, the tree rings from across the eastern Mediterranean, all of them telling the same story. Starting around 1250 BCE and intensifying through 1200 BCE, a mega-drought settled over the region. Not a bad year, not a difficult decade. A multi-century aridification event, driven by a shift in the Atlantic storm system that moved the winter rains northward and left the eastern Mediterranean progressively, relentlessly drier. The Sorek Cave in Israel contains a record of precipitation going back 150,000 years. The data from the Late Bronze Age shows a steady, unprecedented decline in rainfall, reaching its most severe point around 1150 BCE, precisely when the last Bronze Age cities were going dark. Brandon Drake, who analyzed the cave data, concluded that declining sea surface temperatures in the Mediterranean lowered evaporation rates, the westerly winds took in less moisture, and the result was a collapse in annual rainfall across the entire region simultaneously. A drought of this scale, sustained over decades, meant one thing above all others: the grain ran out. And in a Bronze Age palace economy, where the palace was simultaneously the granary, the bank, the employer, the tax authority, and the distributor of everything that kept a city functioning, when the grain ran out, the entire system seized. The palace in Hattusa allocated grain to its vassal kingdoms. Those kingdoms used it to pay their workers. Those workers used it to feed their families and plant next year's crop. Break that chain at any point and the system stutters. Break it at the top, drought destroying the harvest year after year. And the system doesn't just stutter, it stops. The drought explains the famine. The famine explains the desperate letters. The desperate letters explain the political instability. But does the drought explain everything? No. And this is where it gets complicated. Because at roughly the same time as the drought, within the same 50-year window between 1225 and 1175 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean was also hit by something else. Eric Klein, a professor at George Washington University and the author of what is arguably the most important recent book on the Bronze Age collapse, titled, with admirable directness, "On 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed," conducted research with the geophysicist Amos Nur that revealed something extraordinary. During that same 50-year period, the Mediterranean region was struck by a rapid series of major earthquakes. Not isolated events, a sequence. An earthquake storm moving along the fault lines of the Eastern Mediterranean, hitting city after city in succession. Mycenae was struck first, around 1250 BCE, and evidence in the form of crushed bodies buried under collapsed buildings. Then Tiryns, then sites in Anatolia, then Cyprus. The earthquake storm tracked the collapse geographically. It moved roughly in the same direction and at the same pace as the civilisational failure. Earthquakes didn't cause the Bronze Age collapse on their own. The Bronze Age world had survived earthquakes before, but earthquakes hitting cities already weakened by drought and famine, cities whose granaries were already depleted, whose populations were already stressed, whose governments were already sending desperate letters to neighbors who couldn't help. That is a different calculation entirely. One disaster is survivable. One disaster on top of another disaster on top of another disaster, each one undermining whatever capacity for recovery the previous one had left. That is what the Bronze Age faced. And it wasn't finished yet. Into this world of drought and earthquake and famine came the people the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples. They arrived by sea and by land, men, women, children packed into ox carts, cattle lowing beside them, household goods piled high. They kept moving toward the coast, toward Egypt, toward wherever they hoped there was still food. The Egyptians carved them into temple walls, not as ghosts, not as legend, but as people, desperate, dispossessed, moving. For most of the 20th century, historians made them the villains of the story. The Sea Peoples invaded, the civilizations fell. Simple, clean, wrong. The theory collapsed under a single question nobody could answer. If the Sea Peoples destroyed everything, why did Kassite Babylonia fall? It had no coastline. The Mitanni had no coastline. You cannot raid an inland empire from the sea. And if the sea peoples weren't the cause there, the logic unravels everywhere else too. The more honest reading of the evidence is darker and sadder. The sea peoples weren't the cause of the collapse. They were its product, driven from their own homelands by the same drought, the same famine, the same unraveling. They moved the way the hungry always move, toward wherever survival still seemed possible. The ox carts weren't carrying soldiers' plunder. They were carrying everything a family owns when they have nowhere left to return to. And in moving, desperate, dispossessed, hungry, they became the final pressure on systems already near breaking point. They didn't start the fire, but they arrived just as the last walls were holding, and their movement through the coastal cities severed the last trade routes that might otherwise have kept those walls standing. They are part of the story. They are not the whole story. Which brings us to the theory that I find most compelling and most unsettling. It is called systems collapse theory. Its architect wasn't an ancient historian. He was a scholar of complex systems named Joseph Tainter, and in 1988 he proposed something that sounds almost too simple, until you sit with it long enough for it to become genuinely disturbing. Complex societies, Tainter argued, don't collapse because something destroys them. They collapse because of what they are, because complexity itself, past a certain point, becomes a trap. The Bronze Age world was the most complex, most interdependent civilization that had ever existed. Tin from Central Asia, copper from Cyprus, cedar from Lebanon, grain from Egypt. None of these places could function without the others. The cedar meant nothing without the copper. The copper meant nothing without the tin. The tin meant nothing without the grain to feed the miners. You pull one thread, and the others could adjust. The network was dense enough, resilient enough to root around a single disaster, but pull several threads at once. Drought cutting the grain here, an earthquake leveling a port city there, desperate migrations severing the maritime route somewhere else. And the network didn't weaken. It didn't degrade slowly. It came apart all at once, because every part of it depended on every other part, and when enough parts failed simultaneously, the remainder had nothing left to hold on to. Researchers who modeled the Bronze Age trade system as a mathematical network found something that should have been reassuring and wasn't. The system was extraordinarily robust. A single city destroyed, a single route severed, even a single empire weakened. The network absorbed it, compensated, survived. It had been built over centuries to survive exactly that kind of individual blow. What it hadn't been built to survive was everything at once. When the models simulated multiple simultaneous disruptions, drought paired with earthquakes paired with migration pressure, the network didn't bend. It snapped, not gradually, catastrophically, faster than any single civilization could respond, faster than any king writing urgent letters in cuneiform could have understood what was happening before it was already over. That is what the Bronze Age experienced. Not one disaster, a perfect storm, drought, famine, earthquakes, migrations, and perhaps disease, each one stripping away a layer of resilience that might have absorbed the next blow. Any single one of them, the evidence suggests, probably wasn't enough, not even close to enough. But all of them together, arriving faster than the system could answer, that was enough. And here is the thing about that explanation that should give you pause, not because it's ancient, because it isn't. The Bronze Age world was interconnected in ways that had never existed before. Trade networks spanning thousands of kilometers, cities dependent on materials from places they had never seen, palace economies so specialized they couldn't breathe without the continuous arrival of goods from abroad. Remove any of it, and the bronze couldn't be made, the tools couldn't be produced, the cities couldn't be fed. We live in that world. A drought in one continent moves food prices on another. A single ship wedged in a single canal causes shortages across the planet. A financial crisis in one country becomes a recession everywhere. We depend on supply chains, stretching to places most of us will never visit, for materials we have no domestic alternative to, held together by systems of trust and agreement that work beautifully, right up until they don't. Eric Klein, who has spent his career studying the Bronze Age, said something that stays with you. In a complex system such as our world today, a tipping point is all it might take for the overall system to become destabilized, leading to collapse. He was talking about the Bronze Age. He was also talking about now. I'm not telling you this to frighten you. The Bronze Age collapse happened. People survived it. The world was rebuilt. The story doesn't end in ash. But the lesson the evidence keeps pointing toward, quietly and insistently, is that complexity is not the same as strength. That the same interconnections which created the extraordinary wealth and culture and capability of the Bronze Age also made it fragile in ways its architects never imagined. The Bronze Age kings knew their world was complex. They traded across it, administered it, wrote letters across it in multiple languages. What they didn't know, what nobody knew, because nobody had seen it happen before, was that a system complex enough to produce peace treaties in silver and merchant archives in clay, and the world's first international economy, was also complex enough to collapse completely. They found out. We have been sitting in the ash for a while now, in Ugarit and Hattusa and Pylos and the ruins of the world that burned, and it is time, finally, to look forward, because the Bronze Age collapse was not the end of the story. It was not even the end of humanity's capacity to build something worth building. In the next part of tonight's story, we're going to leave the ruins. We're going to follow the people who survived, not the kings, not the empires, but the ordinary people who kept going when there was almost nothing left to keep going with. And we're going to find out what they built from the ruins of everything that burned, because what they built, quietly, slowly, over 400 years of darkness, is the world you live in. 400 years is a long time to be in the dark. Let's be honest about what the Greek Dark Ages actually were. Not a metaphor, not a period of mild decline. Between roughly 1100 and 700 BCE, 3,100 to 2,700 years ago, the Greek world contracted to almost nothing. The population of the Peloponnese dropped by perhaps 90%. Up to 90% of small sites were simply abandoned. The palaces were gone. The trade networks were gone. The writing was gone. The elaborate Bronze Age administrative systems that had coordinated the movement of goods and people across the entire Mediterranean, gone. What remained were villages, small ones. Communities of people living in simpler houses, making simpler pottery, trading locally. Their world shrunk to the distance a person could walk in a day. No more ships carrying Mycenaean pottery to Egypt, no more letters to the pharaoh, no more scribes recording the distribution of hides to shoemakers and palace archives. Just people, fields, the memory of something larger, carried in stories told around fires. Those stories matter more than they might seem to, because the Bronze Age didn't disappear from human memory. It retreated into oral tradition, into the songs and stories told by traveling poets, and memorized across generations in the absence of writing, passed from singer to singer through the 400 years of the Dark Age. And somewhere in the 8th century BCE, a poet, possibly named Homer, possibly not a single person at all, but a tradition, composed the Iliad and the Odyssey from those 400-year-old memories. The heroes of the Bronze Age, Achilles, Odysseus, Agamemnon, the walls of Troy, preserved in oral verse through an entire dark age, and then written down when writing came back. They kept the stories, and the stories kept the Bronze Age alive until someone could write it down again. That is not a small thing. In the face of a catastrophe that erased writing, destroyed the administrative systems that depended on it, shrank the world to the size of a village. Ordinary people, carrying stories in their heads, kept the memory of what had been possible, kept the knowledge that there had once been something larger. And that knowledge, transmitted in poetry, in myth, in the particular way that oral cultures preserve what matters, became the seed from which classical Greece eventually grew. Human resilience doesn't always look like rebuilding. Sometimes it looks like remembering. But not everyone went into the dark. On the Lebanese coast, in the city-states of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, in what is now Lebanon, something remarkable happened. The Bronze Age collapse hit the Phoenician cities too. Trade networks collapsed. The Egyptian empire that had provided protection withdrew. The world they had traded in ceased to exist, and the Phoenicians, descended from the Bronze Age Canaanites, their coastal cities spared the worst of the destruction, adapted. Where the Bronze Age trade networks had been dominated by palace economies and royal diplomacy, the Phoenicians built something different. A merchant network, not an empire. There was no Phoenician king, no Phoenician army conquering territory, just traders, ships, colonies established along the Mediterranean coast, not as military outposts, but as trading stations, stopping points where Phoenician merchants could resupply, exchange goods, and extend their reach further west. They sailed to Cyprus, to Sicily, to Sardinia, to Spain, and the Atlantic coast of Morocco. Some of their ships may have circumnavigated Africa. In each place they went, they left a trading post, a community, a connection. And they carried something with them more valuable than the purple dye or the cedar wood or the bronze they traded. They carried the alphabet, the Phoenician alphabet, 22 letters, purely consonantal, derived from the earlier Canaanite script that had itself evolved during the Bronze Age, was a revolution in literacy. The Bronze Age writing systems, Linear B in Greece, cuneiform in Mesopotamia, had required years of specialist training to learn. Hundreds of characters, a lifetime of practice. Literacy in the Bronze Age was confined to a tiny professional class of scribes. The Phoenician alphabet could be learned in weeks, 22 symbols, 1 symbol per sound. Anyone, a merchant's apprentice, a sailor, a farmer who wanted to record a transaction, could learn it without years in a scribal school. And as the Phoenicians spread across the Mediterranean, the alphabet spread with them. The Greeks adopted it in the 8th century BCE and added vowels, creating the Greek alphabet. The Romans adapted the Greek alphabet to create Latin, and from Latin, through the long chain of the medieval world and the printing press and everything that followed, came the alphabet you are reading in right now. The letters on this page trace back in an unbroken line to Phoenician merchants sailing the Mediterranean in the Dark Age after the Bronze Age collapse, trading their purple dye and their cedar wood, carrying their 22 letters from port to port, not trying to save civilization, just trying to make a living. That is how the world was rebuilt, not by heroes, by merchants. And in Greece, slowly, the lights came back on. The Dark Age ended not with a single event, but with a gradual accumulation of small recoveries. Population began to grow again. Villages became towns. Trade connections that had been purely local began to extend outward, following the Phoenician routes that had maintained connectivity through the darkness. The alphabet arrived, carried by Phoenician traders, adopted and adapted by Greek speakers who hadn't had a writing system for 400 years. And then, something happened that nobody could have predicted from the ruins of Mycenae. The Greeks took everything the Bronze Age had built, the administrative sophistication, the trade networks, the oral traditions, the myths and stories, and combined it with 400 years of having been forced to think for themselves, to solve problems without the palace bureaucracy, to govern their small communities without the top-heavy palace economy that had made the Bronze Age both magnificent and fragile. And from that combination, from the Bronze Age inheritance and the Dark Age education, they built classical Greece, philosophy, democracy, theater, mathematics as a theoretical discipline, history as a field of inquiry, the Olympic Games, the alphabet, now with vowels, producing a literature from Homer to Plato that would define Western thought for 2,500 years. All of it grew from the ruins of the Bronze Age world. All of it was built by people whose grandparents' had lived in villages in the dark, keeping stories alive around fires, waiting for the world to become possible again. Yeah, and the Bronze Age itself, the palace economies and the trade networks and the merchant archives and the desperate letters baked in the fires, became legend, became myth, became Homer's Troy and the heroes of the Iliad, became, 3,000 years later, a mystery that archaeologists are still trying to solve. There is an island off the coast of Cyprus called Enkomi. In the ruins of the late Bronze Age city there, archaeologists found something in the destruction layer, the thin black line that marks the end of the Bronze Age everywhere they've dug. A bronze stand, beautifully made, covered in figures and decorative work that represents the finest craftsmanship of the late Bronze Age. It was clearly valuable, clearly important to whoever owned it. It was left behind in the evacuation or the flight or whatever ended that city. Someone left their most beautiful object in the ruins. Maybe there wasn't time to take it. Maybe they thought they were coming back. Maybe they were already gone before they could choose. The stand sat in the ruins for 3,000 years. It was found in the 20th century and is now in a museum in Nicosia. I think about the person who left it. Whether they survived, whether they found somewhere else to go, whether they told their children about the city they'd come from, the beautiful thing they'd had to leave behind, whether those children told their children. We will never know. The Dark Age swallowed them completely. But someone kept going. Enough people kept going that the cities were eventually rebuilt, that the alphabet spread, that Greece emerged from the darkness and wrote down the stories that had been carried in human memory for 400 years, that the world was made again. Not the same world, a different one, smaller in some ways, larger in others. Less magnificent in its bronze and lapis lazuli, more democratic in its iron and its 22 letters that anyone could learn. They kept going, not because they knew it would work out, not because they had any assurance that the Dark Age would end, but because what else do you do? When the world has ended and you are still in it, you keep going. You plant what fields you can. You tell the stories. You carry the letters from port to port. You leave what you can't carry, and you walk toward whatever comes next. The Bronze Age ended. The world did not. You're listening to this. In the dark, in your bed, in a world built on the foundations of everything those people left behind. Because enough of them kept going. The alphabet you read in, theirs. The democracy you inherited, built by people who learned from the collapse of everything that came before. The impulse to write things down, to keep records, to press voices into clay or paper or pixel so they won't be lost. That impulse, which runs from the first scribe in Uruk, through Ammurapi's desperate letter, through the Phoenician merchants carrying their 22 letters through the dark. That impulse is why you know any of this. Why any of this survived to be known. The chain from them to you was never broken. Even when it came close. Even in the ash. Even in the 400 years of silence. Even in the Bronze Age collapse, the most sudden, the most complete, the most mysterious civilisational catastrophe in recorded human history, the chain held. Because people kept going. Because what else do you do? Sleep well, dream of blue Mediterranean waters and ships loaded with copper and cedar and tin, moving between cities that believed they would last forever. They didn't. But what they built, the letters you read in, the stories you tell, the stubborn human refusal to be the last one that lasted. The Bronze Age ended. We didn't. Good night.